Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into the life and career of Kamala Harris.
Sounds fascinating.
It is. She's a really interesting figure.
Yeah.
Went from prosecutor to the vice president of the United States,
Wow.
and now she's a presidential nominee.
And we're using a video essay as our main source for this deep dive.
Exactly.
So what makes Harris's journey so interesting is that she embodies this apparent paradox. The activist who, operates within the system that she critiques, the progressive prosecutor.
Right.
And so we'll be unpacking how these contrasting elements have played out in her life and her career, and how they might affect, how she approaches the presidency. You might be wondering, what exactly is a progressive prosecutor?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I fully get it either.
Well, it's someone who tries to reform the criminal justice system from within, focusing on rehabilitation and addressing the root causes of crime, rather than just punishment.
Okay.
So we'll definitely be keeping that question in mind as we go through her story.
Sounds good. Let's start at the beginning with her early influences.
Absolutely. Kamala Harris was born in 1964 to immigrant parents. Her father was from Jamaica and earned his PhD in economics, while her mother came from India and also really prioritized education.
So both her parents really valued education.
Yes, very much so. And they both ended up in Berkeley, California.
Okay.
That's where Kamala and her younger sister Maya were raised,
Right.
primarily by their single mother after their parents' divorce.
Gotcha.
So it was the height of the civil rights movement, and they lived in a predominantly black neighborhood.
Wow.
It was a very formative environment to grow up in.
Definitely. And how do you think this upbringing shaped her worldview?
What's fascinating here is how this blend of activism and personal drive really seems to be key to understanding Harris. Her upbringing, with its strong emphasis on education and a front-row seat to the fight for justice, clearly instilled in her a deep sense of fighting for what's right values she carries to this day.
And we see that come through loud and clear in her famous quote, "My mother had another lesson she used to teach. Never let anyone tell you who you are. You show them who you are."
Exactly. It speaks to her resilience and determination. And this drive is apparent throughout her education. She attended Howard University,
Oh, wow.
a historically black university known for its academic rigor and its legacy of activism. But she didn't just study. She took on leadership roles, joined the debate team, and even worked summer jobs, including one at McDonald's.
Wow, a future vice president flipping burgers. That's pretty amazing.
It's fascinating, right? Even while juggling internships and activism, she held down a summer job at McDonald's.
Wow.
This speaks to her incredible work ethic, a trait that's followed her throughout her career.
Yeah.
And speaking of internships, she even interned at places like the Federal Trade Commission.
So even early on, she was interested in working within existing institutions.
Right. And this highlights the paradox we mentioned earlier. On the one hand, she was engaged in activism, critical of the system, participating in protests. Yet she also worked within those very institutions, seemingly embracing a more pragmatic approach. It's like she was trying to understand the system from the inside out, figuring out how to make it work better.
Almost like she was laying the groundwork for her later career.
Exactly. And this duality continues as she enters law school and embarks on her career as a prosecutor.
Now, that's a career path that is often associated with being tough on crime. How does that fit into the whole progressive idea?
That's a great question, and it's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Harris positioned herself as a progressive prosecutor, which raised eyebrows and sparked a lot of debate.
Makes sense.
To really understand this, we need to look at both sides of the coin.
Right.
The actions that aligned with progressive values,
Yeah.
and those that seemed more in line with traditional tough-on-crime prosecution.
Okay, so let's dive into those examples.
Let's start with the progressive side. Throughout her career, Harris emphasized data-driven crime prevention, focusing on addressing the root causes of criminal activity. She wasn't afraid to push boundaries either. Remember her controversial truancy initiative? She actually prosecuted parents whose children missed too much school.
Yeah, that was definitely a controversial move. What was she hoping to achieve with that?
It was certainly controversial, but it speaks to her focus on early intervention and breaking cycles of disadvantage.
Oh, okay.
Her thinking was that chronic absenteeism can have serious long-term consequences for students, and that addressing it early on could help prevent them from falling behind and potentially ending up in the criminal justice system later in life.
Right.
Of course, her approach was criticized for potentially criminalizing poverty and exacerbating existing inequalities.
I can see how that could happen.
It's a good example of how complex these issues are and how even well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences.
Yeah.
But let's look at some other examples of her work that were less controversial. She fought against the death penalty, took on big banks after the 2008 housing crisis,
Wow.
and even secured $1 billion for victims of a predatory for-profit university.
That's incredible.
And remember her bold move during the Proposition 8 debate,
Mhm.
the one that sought to ban same-sex marriage in California?
Oh, yeah. That was a big one.
Harris defied the proposition and directly ordered the Los Angeles clerk to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples anyway.
Wow.
These actions show a clear commitment to social justice and holding powerful institutions accountable, hallmarks of progressive thought.
So she was definitely making waves and challenging the status quo in some pretty significant ways.
Absolutely. But as I mentioned, there's another side to this story.
Oh.
The side that made some people question whether she was really as progressive as she claimed to be.
Okay, let's hear it. What are the counterarguments?
Well, for one, she appealed a ruling that could have ended the death penalty in California. And when the Supreme Court ordered California to reduce prison overcrowding, she supported the governor's fight against releasing prisoners.
Really?
These actions seemed to contradict her earlier stances on criminal justice reform and raised questions about her true commitment to those ideals.
So it seems like she was trying to balance her progressive ideals with the realities of her job as a prosecutor.
Right.
Not an easy task, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a tension that has followed her throughout her career.
I see.
This is where that question we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Can someone be both an activist and an effective operator within the very system they seek to change? Becomes really relevant.
Right.
Her career as a prosecutor is a great example of her trying to navigate that very question.
It definitely seems like a complicated balancing act.
It is.
And it makes me wonder how these experiences might have shaped her approach to leadership on a national stage.
That's a great question, and one we'll definitely explore further as we continue our deep dive.
Okay.
But before we move on to her time in the Senate and beyond, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned so far.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
So far, we've seen how her upbringing in a politically active environment shaped her early commitment to social justice, but also how she was drawn to working within existing systems,
Right.
perhaps with the goal of changing them from the inside.
Exactly.
And as a prosecutor, we've seen her wrestle with this tension between activism and pragmatism, making both progressive moves and decisions that seem to contradict those ideals.
Right.
It's a complex picture for sure.
It is, and it raises a lot of interesting questions about how she might approach the presidency.
Yeah.
But before we get to that, we need to understand the rest of her journey.
Okay.
So let's move on to her time in the Senate and her eventual rise to the vice presidency.
Okay. Let's rewind a bit and pick up the story from there.
Picking up where we left off, Harris won the California Senate seat in 2016.
Right.
This is a time when a lot of progressives felt really shaken by Trump's victory.
Yep.
You know, he really campaigned on personality and spectacle, not so much on, detailed policies.
Oh, yeah. It was a wild election for sure. And I remember a lot of people felt like Harris's background as a prosecutor,
Yeah,
her reputation for being tough, really resonated in that moment.
exactly. People were looking for someone who could stand up to Trump, hold him accountable, and Harris really seemed to fit the bill. She quickly made a name for herself in the Senate, using her prosecutorial skills to grill Trump administration officials during hearings.
Right.
Those moments went viral, and she really became a rising star within the Democratic Party.
Yeah, it's funny to think that the skills she honed as a prosecutor,
Right.
which some people criticized as being too tough on crime,
Yeah.
actually became her greatest asset on the national stage.
It's a fascinating example of how context can completely change the perception of someone's skills and experience.
Totally.
And then in 2020, she decided to take another big leap. She launched her own bid for the presidency.
So she went from prosecutor to senator to presidential hopeful in just a few years.
Yeah.
That's a pretty meteoric rise. What was her campaign like?
It was a bold move, no doubt. But ultimately, she didn't gain enough traction in the crowded Democratic primary field.
Right.
Remember, there were a lot of other candidates vying for the nomination,
Yeah.
each with their own strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, it was a pretty intense primary season with a lot of different viewpoints within the Democratic Party. Why do you think she struggled to stand out?
That's a good question. There are probably a few reasons. For one, she was still relatively new to the national stage.
Okay.
So she didn't have the same level of name recognition as some of the other candidates.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, she was trying to appeal to a broad range of voters, which sometimes led to accusations that she wasn't progressive enough for some Democrats.
Right. We saw that tension play out during her time as a prosecutor.
Exactly.
It seems like that balancing act between activism and pragmatism continued to be a theme throughout her career.
Absolutely. But then, just when it seemed like her political ambitions might be fading, there was a twist. Joe Biden, who ultimately won the Democratic nomination,
Right.
chose her as his running mate.
And the rest, as they say, is history. They won the election,
They did.
making her the first female vice president of the United States.
Hmm.
What do you think made them a good team?
That's an interesting question. On the surface, they seemed like a bit of an odd couple.
Uh-huh.
Biden represented a more traditional, experienced approach to politics,
Right.
while Harris brought a fresh perspective and a reputation for being tough and uncompromising.
Yeah.
But I think that contrast actually worked in their favor. They complemented each other's strengths and weaknesses.
And that toughness that we talked about earlier
Yes.
really came into play when she was tasked with addressing the root causes of migration from Central America.
Right.
That's a complex and long-standing issue that has stumped U.S. policymakers for decades.
It has.
What was her approach?
Right. And she faced a lot of criticism for her handling of the border situation. Although it's important to note that her actual mandate was different from what was often portrayed in the media.
Boy.
She wasn't in charge of border security or enforcement.
Right.
Her focus was on addressing the underlying issues in Central America that were driving people to leave their homes in the first place.
I see.
Things like poverty, violence, and corruption.
So she was essentially trying to tackle the problem at its source, rather than just reacting to the symptoms at the border.
Exactly.
That sounds like a pretty daunting task.
Absolutely. And while migration numbers from the targeting countries did decrease during her tenure, it's difficult to say how much of that can be directly attributed to her efforts. These are complex issues with deep roots, and real change takes time.
For sure. And then another unexpected turn of events.
Yeah.
Biden decided not to seek re-election, paving the way for Harris to become the Democratic nominee for president.
It was a historic moment, marking the first time a woman of color was nominated for president by a major party. And it set up a fascinating election against an opponent who, like Trump, seemed to campaign more on personality than policy.
Right.
This raises a crucial question. What kind of leader does America need in these turbulent times? Will it be substance over spectacle?
That is the million-dollar question. And to answer it, we need to take a closer look at Harris's record and what it tells us about her potential presidency.
Yeah.
We've seen how her journey has been shaped by a complex interplay of activism, pragmatism, and a deep-seated commitment to justice.
But the question remains, what does justice even mean in this context?
Right.
How will she balance her progressive ideals with the realities of governing a complex and often divided nation?
We've explored how her experiences as a prosecutor, both the progressive moves and the decisions that seem to contradict those ideals, have shaped her approach to leadership.
Uh-huh.
We've seen how she brought those same skills and that same balancing act to the national stage as a senator and then as a vice president. But now she's facing the ultimate test.
Yeah. Her critics often point to inconsistencies in her record, particularly her stances on criminal justice,
Okay.
questioning whether she was a true progressive prosecutor or a pragmatist who sometimes prioritized the status quo.
Right. And that tension between activism and pragmatism seems to be at the heart of the debate about her potential presidency.
It does.
But even her detractors acknowledge her lack of personal scandals and her generally consistent character.
Yeah.
Her life story is a testament to hard work, resilience, and a commitment to public service, values that resonate with many Americans.
It's a compelling narrative, for sure. One that reminds us that leaders are, at the end of the day, human beings shaped by their experiences.
Definitely.
It also underscores the importance of personal integrity in positions of power.
So as we head into the final part of our deep dives,
Yeah.
I'm wondering, what stands out to you most about her story? What are your key takeaways as you consider her potential presidency?
Keep in mind, she is a product of the very system she now seeks to lead. What does that mean for the changes she might be able or willing to make? We'll leave you with that food for thought as we move into the final part of our deep dive into the life and career of Kamala Harris.
So we've really dug deep into Kamala Harris's past, her upbringing, her career, the choices she made, and the challenges she faced. Now it feels like the big question looming over everything is, what does her potential presidency actually mean for America?
You're hitting the nail on the head there. Her story isn't just about one person's ambition. It intersects with these huge shifts in American society and politics. Think about it. She's the first woman of color nominated for president by a major party.
Yeah, that's not just a footnote in history. It's a massive change in who we even imagine as our leader.
Exactly. It reflects how our demographics are evolving, but also how we're grappling with ideas of representation and who gets to hold power. Her very presence on the ballot is a sign of progress, no matter what your political views are.
But symbolism aside, I'm also curious about the nuts and bolts policy governing style, all that. Her track record seems like this mix of bold moves and more cautious ones. How do we make sense of that looking ahead?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's no crystal ball, but we can look at the themes that have emerged in her career. Remember that tension between activism and pragmatism we kept coming back to? That's likely to continue.
So she might champion progressive causes, but be willing to work within the existing system to make change happen, even if it's incremental.
It's a good bet. Some on the left might worry she'll compromise too much, but others see her experience as an asset. She knows how things work or don't from the inside.
And her leadership style. We've talked about her being tough, a skilled negotiator. How might that play out in the Oval Office?
Well, think of it this way. She's been both a prosecutor and an advocate throughout her career. That suggests she's comfortable with pushing for what she believes in, but UT also able to strategize and find common ground when needed.
That makes me think of something you said earlier, that the political climate is so polarized right now. Maybe that ability to negotiate will be even more important than it used to be?
It's a good point. Will she be a unifier or further divide the country? Her supporters will say she's tough but fair. Her critics might say she's too focused on winning the argument. Only time will tell how it plays out.
It's funny thinking back to how some people criticized her prosecutorial style. Now, those skills might be exactly what's needed to navigate this incredibly complex political landscape.
Right. It shows how what's seen as a strength or weakness can totally change depending on the circumstances. And that brings us back to the question of what kind of leader America needs right now.
What are your thoughts on that? After diving this deep into Kamala Harris's journey, what stands out to you as the most important takeaway for listeners?
I think it boils down to this. Regardless of whether you support her policies or not, her story is a powerful reminder that America is constantly evolving. We're grappling with who we are, what we value, and what leadership should look like in the 21st century.
Her candidacy forces us to confront those questions head-on. It's not just about her. It's about what WE want for our future.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we leave you with this. Engage with the process. Think critically. And most importantly, make your voice heard. The choices we make individually and collectively will shape the direction of our nation.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life and career of Kamala Harris. Until next time, keep on learning.